Nobody believed her. Not the teachers, not the social workers, not even the police officers who'd responded to her desperate calls for help. Sarah was 15 years old, and she'd been trying to escape her stepfather's abuse for 2 years. Every adult she trusted had failed her. Every system designed to protect her had looked the other way. So she ran. And on a cold Los Angeles night in 1995, she ran straight into Tupac Shakur. He was the first person who listened, the first person who believed, the first person who decided that protecting her mattered more than staying out of trouble. And that decision would test everything Tupac believed about justice, courage, and what it means to stand up when everyone else sits down. Before we begin this powerful story, if these narratives about Tupac and the voiceless people he fought for move you, please subscribe and hit that like button. These stories shine light on the courage it takes to stand against injustice. Your support keeps these untold truths alive. Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now. The story: the night was colder than usual for Los Angeles in late October. Tupac Shakur had just wrapped a grueling studio session that lasted until 2 a.m., his voice raw from recording, his mind exhausted but unable to rest. He drove through the empty streets of South Central, windows down, letting the night air clear his head. The city was quieter at this hour, stripped of its daytime chaos, revealing a different kind of truth beneath the surface. He stopped at a 24-hour convenience store on Western Avenue to grab water and cigarettes. That's when he saw her. A girl, maybe 15 or 16, sitting on the curb near the entrance, hunched over with her arms wrapped around her knees. She wore an oversized jacket that looked like it had seen better days, and her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. Most people walked past her without a second glance, stepping around her like she was part of the furniture. Tupac stood there for a moment, watching. Something about the way she sat, so small, so defeated, pulled at something deep in his chest. He'd seen countless kids on these streets over the years, runaways, throwaways, kids the system had chewed up and spit out. But something about this girl felt different. Or maybe it was just that tonight, exhausted and raw, he couldn't bring himself to look away. He walked over and sat down on the curb next to her, not too close, giving her space. She didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cracked pavement between her worn-out sneakers. Tupac didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, present, letting the silence speak. After a long moment, he asked if she was hungry. The girl's shoulders tensed. She glanced at him sideways, her eyes quick and wary, like an animal that had learned to expect danger from every direction. She shook her head, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying her. Tupac stood up, went into the store, and came back with a sandwich, chips, and a bottle of orange juice. He set them down beside her and sat back down on the curb. She stared at the food for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the sandwich. She ate quickly, hungrily, like someone who hadn't had a real meal in days. Tupac waited, not pushing, not asking questions. When she finished, she finally spoke, a voice barely above a whisper. She thanked him. He told her it wasn't a big deal, that she looked like she could use it. Then, he asked the question he already knew the answer to: where were her parents? The girl's body went rigid. Her hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Tupac thought she might bolt, might disappear into the night, like so many others before her. But she didn't run. Instead, something in her seemed to crack, just a little, just enough. She told him she didn't have parents anymore, not ones that mattered. Her name was Sarah. She was 15 years old, and for the past 2 years, she'd been living in a nightmare that nobody seemed willing to acknowledge. Her mother had remarried 3 years ago, after Sarah's father died in a car accident. The new husband, her stepfather, seemed normal at first. Friendly, helpful, the kind of guy who coached Little League and volunteered at the church. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. It started small, comments about her body, inappropriate touches disguised as affection. Then, it escalated. He'd come into her room at night when her mother was asleep. He'd corner her in the hallway when they were alone. He'd threaten her, telling her that nobody would believe her if she said anything, that she'd destroy the family, that her mother would hate her. Sarah tried to tell her mother multiple times, but her mother didn't want to hear it. She accused Sarah of being jealous, of trying to ruin her marriage, of making up stories for attention. The rejection from her own mother was almost worse than the abuse itself. So Sarah went to her teacher, a woman she trusted, a woman who'd always been kind to her. The teacher listened, seemed concerned, and reported it to the school counselor. The counselor called Child Protective Services. A social worker came to the house, asked questions, looked around. The stepfather was calm, cooperative, sympathetic. He suggested Sarah was struggling with her father's death, acting out, seeking attention. The mother backed him up. The house was clean. There were no visible signs of abuse. The social worker closed the case. Sarah tried again, 6 months later, this time calling the police directly. 2 officers showed up, interviewed everyone separately, but the story was the same. The stepfather denied everything. The mother supported him, and Sarah, terrified and alone, couldn't provide the kind of concrete evidence the system required. No photographs, no witnesses, no hospital records, just her word against his. The officers said they'd file a report, but warned her that false accusations were serious. They left. After that, things got worse. The stepfather became more careful, but also more aggressive. He knew the system had checked and found nothing. He knew he was protected, and Sarah knew she was trapped. So she ran. 3 days ago she'd packed a small backpack with clothes, taken what little money she'd saved from babysitting jobs, and walked out the door while her mother and stepfather were at work. She'd been sleeping in alleys, in parks, anywhere she could find that felt remotely safe. She'd been eating whatever she could afford or find, and she'd been invisible, just another lost kid in a city full of them. Tupac listened to all of this without interrupting. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched, but his voice stayed calm and steady. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he told her something that would change both their lives. He told her she didn't have to run anymore. He told her he believed her, and he told her they were going to fix this. Sarah looked at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. Nobody had ever said those words to her before. Nobody had ever believed her. Nobody had ever suggested that fixing it was even possible. She started to cry, not the quiet, controlled tears she'd learned to hide, but the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from years of suppressed pain, finally finding release. Tupac didn't try to stop her or comfort her with empty words. He just stayed there, solid and present, letting her know through his silence that she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Tupac made calls. He reached out to lawyers he knew, advocates who worked with abuse survivors, people who understood how to navigate the system when the system was designed to fail. He arranged for Sarah to stay with a trusted friend, a woman who ran a safe house for at-risk youth, someone who'd dealt with cases like this before and knew how to protect kids while building a case. But Tupac also knew that wasn't enough. The stepfather needed to face consequences, the mother needed to be confronted with the truth, and the system needed to be forced to do its job. He hired a private investigator, a former cop named Torres, who'd left the force after becoming disgusted with how often cases like Sarah's were swept under the rug. Torres was expensive, but Tupac didn't care. He told Torres to dig into the stepfather's background, to find out if there were other victims, other complaints, anything that could build a pattern. What Torres found was worse than anyone expected. The stepfather had a history, not a criminal record. He'd been too careful for that, but a trail of red flags that authorities had either missed or ignored. He'd been asked to leave 2 previous volunteer positions at youth organizations due to inappropriate behavior. There'd been complaints from neighbors at his last address about arguing and a young girl's screams. Nothing had ever been formally investigated. Nothing had ever been documented in a way that mattered. But Torres documented it now. He interviewed neighbors. He talked to former co-workers. He built a file that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Tupac worked on Sarah, helping her process the trauma, encouraging her to speak with a therapist, preparing her for what came next. 2 weeks after that night at the convenience store, Torres and Tupac walked into the police station with Sarah and a lawyer. They presented the file, thick with evidence, witness statements, documented patterns of behavior. They demanded a full investigation. They threatened to go to the media if the case was dismissed again. This time, the police couldn't look away. This time, there was too much evidence, too much pressure, too many people watching. Detectives were assigned. The stepfather was brought in for questioning. A warrant was issued to search the house. What they found in that search was damning. Hidden cameras in Sarah's bedroom, photographs stored on an encrypted hard drive, evidence that he'd been documenting his abuse, collecting it like trophies, the kind of evidence that makes prosecutors' jobs easy and defense attorneys sweat. The stepfather was arrested, charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of a minor, possession of child pornography, and a list of other crimes that would ensure he spent decades behind bars if convicted. The mother, confronted with irrefutable evidence, finally broke down and admitted she'd suspected, but been too afraid to act. She was devastated, destroyed by the realization that her silence had enabled years of suffering. Sarah watched it all unfold from the safety of the shelter. Tupac visited her regularly, bringing food, books, just sitting with her, and reminding her that she'd done nothing wrong, that she was brave, that she was a survivor. He told her that speaking up, even when nobody listened the first time or the second time, had been the most courageous thing anyone could do. The case went to trial 6 months later. Sarah testified, her voice shaking but clear, telling the jury exactly what had happened to her. The defense tried to discredit her, to paint her as a troubled teen with a grudge. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. The stepfather was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He'd be an old man before he ever saw freedom again. And even then, he'd be a registered sex offender for life, his name and face permanently marked in databases designed to warn communities about predators. Sarah cried when she heard the verdict. Not tears of joy exactly, but tears of relief, of validation, of finally being believed after years of being dismissed and doubted. Tupac was there in the courtroom, sitting in the back row, watching her find her voice and reclaim her power. After the trial, Sarah stayed in the shelter for another year while she finished high school. Tupac set up a trust fund for her education, anonymously at first until she found out and insisted on thanking him. She eventually moved out of state to attend college, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the trauma that had defined too much of her young life. She wrote to Tupac occasionally over the years, letters updating him on her progress, on the therapy that was helping her heal, on the small victories that meant everything. She told him that he'd saved her life that night outside the convenience store, that he'd been the first adult to treat her like she mattered, like her truth was worth fighting for. Tupac kept every letter. He never talked about the case publicly, never used it for publicity or credit. This wasn't about him. It was about Sarah, and kids like her, and the systems that failed them over and over again. The story of Sarah became one of those quiet victories that never made headlines, but changed everything for the people involved. Tupac had faced down gangs, corrupt cops and industry sharks throughout his career. But fighting for Sarah, standing up for a 15-year-old girl that the world had given up on, remained one of the most important battles he ever fought. Because courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's sitting on a curb at 2 a.m. and refusing to walk past someone in pain. Sometimes it's believing a story that everyone else has dismissed. Sometimes it's using your resources, your voice, your platform to fight for someone who has no platform of their own. Tupac understood that. He lived it. And in doing so, he proved that real strength isn't about power or fame or influence. Real strength is about using whatever you have to protect those who can't protect themselves. It's about being the voice for the voiceless. It's about refusing to accept injustice, even when fighting it is exhausting and thankless and difficult. It's about stopping when everyone else keeps walking. It's about listening when everyone else turns away. It's about standing up for the runaway that the world forgot. Rest in power, Tupac Shakur. Your legacy lives on not just in music, but in the lives you touched, the battles you fought, and the courage you showed when standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. You reminded us that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite the fear. Thank you for being proof that one person who cares can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to remember that their voice matters. These stories honor Tupac's legacy and the voiceless people he fought for.